What if I told you hipsters and hippies killed communism?
Let's get right into this.
Cue intro.
Welcome to Discography. Today we're going to discuss how evolving music changed the mindset of youth during the Cold War. But let's get some background information first.
The Cold War was a period of high tension between the Communist Soviet Union and the capitalist United States from the end of World War II to the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Basically, the two countries strived for dominance by competing in the space technology, nuclear weapons, and spread for their respective ideology throughout the world. There are many different important aspects of the conflict, but we're gonna take a look at specifically the aspect of how music shaped people's ideology and belief during that time. Alright, let's go to the USSR.
Alright, let's go back to the start of the conflict, to the USSR in 1945. Though the nation had endured heavy losses during World War II, spirits were running high, largely thanks to music. The Kremlin's excessive funding in support of classical pieces, to the extent that by 1939, every Soviet city and region had its own orchestra, opera house, and composers, generated a real love for the genre within the country. Joseph Stalin's government had taken advantage of this and used music to draw attention to the communist ideology, simultaneously berating the capitalist beliefs that had become increasingly powerful in the West. In fact, Arnold Socho, a Soviet musicologist, stated, "Under capitalism, the highest cultural values, in many cases, are fenced off by commercial barriers, such as high prices for tickets, phonograph records, and so forth, for mass audiences. Under socialism, however, art is free from the passive commercialization. The interests of society and artistic interests, per se, corresponding entirely in our country." Even though the Kremlin claimed that these interests belonged to the people, they were usually controlled by a group called the Union of Soviet Composers, whose goal was to ensure that Soviet productions, quote, depicted the positive and wholesome virtues of the new society. For instance, Dmitri Shostakovich's opera, Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district, a variation of Shakespeare's Macbeth, was heavily criticized for being too Western. Pravda, the state newspaper, even published an article called Muddle Instead of Music, which stated,
"The listener is shocked by deliberate dissonance, by a confused stream of sounds. Snatches of melody, the beginnings of a musical phrase, are drowned, emerge again, and disappear in a grinding and squealing roar. To follow this music is most difficult. To remember it, impossible."
Stalin's government imposed heavy restrictions on the citizens' access to Western culture, and since no one in the USSR could compose a normal work without getting completely roasted, the Soviet people had no choice but to listen to works that celebrated the motherland. As a result, people were forced to listen to pieces like the Leningrad Symphony. This work was written to commemorate the failed Nazi invasion of the USSR. It became extremely popular within the nation, and was a major musical demonstration of the power of the Soviet armed forces. Another famous propaganda tune was the Guard Song, performed by the infamous Red Army Choir. Let's give it a listen. As you could probably tell, the song totally exaggerates the army's heroics, to the extent that it states that the soldiers tirelessly cut without missing strikes. You might think it's ridiculous, but those who grew up during the time had these lyrics drilled into their ears from an early age, and eventually they truly believed in the song's message. Furthermore, music promoted Soviet ideologies by discouraging others, exemplified by the lines insulting the fascist Nazis. Therefore, compositions during the early Cold War contributed to the spread of communism and promoted widespread nationalism. However, after Stalin died, tensions were relaxed, musical freedom was allowed to develop, and the patriotic songs that had dominated the previous years began to fade away. Now, let's take a look at the US.
Alright, as you all know, the music of the Cold War is always supporting one side of one ideology of a certain country and contradicting another. These songs are usually based around either the US, Europe, or the Soviet Union. Alright, now let's see some research about the jazz music at the time of the Cold War, also known as cool jazz. If we look at what the National Endowment of the Arts Chairman Dana Gioia has received by interviewing Dave Brubeck, a well-known jazz artist at the time of the Cold War, we can see that most of these songs were rather inspirational than complaining. He states that jazz songs that were wrote were focused more on uplifting the hopes of the Americans and making them believe that they'll prevail and that their ideology will win. In fact, in 1956, the US Department of State sent different jazz artists abroad to spread the ideologies of the US, since they wanted many countries, especially third world countries, or countries that were currently adopting Marxism, to switch to the American ideology. Although, there was still some jazz music targeting a certain person, and by a certain person, of course I mean Stalin. As Stalin's ideologies were controversial at that time, the famous artist Shostakovich was able to sneak in some of his jazz music according to the gramophone. Because of that, jazz music became a political victim of Stalin's cultural clampdown, banned as degenerate music. But of course, jazz music was more popular in the Americas and Europe in the 1920s rather than the USSR. Dave Brubeck also noted that other famous artists such as Louis Armstrong performed at the time in 1962, where he played songs from The Real Ambassador, which he stated in the interview that it was promoting American ideals, simultaneously confronting government leaders about racial equality, uplifting the hopes of the Americans. Now you know what time it is. Analyzing time! 10 people would cheer. We have a song by a very famous singer, which was actually released during the Cold War. I'm pretty sure many of you have heard of Sting, a British singer with various different genres. In this case, we're talking about one of people's favorite genres of music. Drum roll. Controversial. Sting's Russians.
If the Russians love their children too.
It talks about the arms race in 1980 and blames Russians as to why it was a problem.
Money and common sense on either side of the political fence.
This displays that if you want to promote your ideology, you can't try to take over the entire world. And of course, all sides want to spread their ideology. And Sting is trying to show that the only person or only country that's kind of trying to go all crazy and exaggerate it is Russia. He describes that if they really care about their children and their people, they should stop focusing on having more weapons and trying to become stronger, because they're the ones who are apparently making the conflict stronger, and they should stop it. Although, if you look at Tears for Fears' song, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, on the other hand, you might get more of a everybody is at fault kind of feel. Now let's go back to the USSR.
Right, and with that we get to the birth of a new type of music. Dubstep. Oh, kidding. I'm obviously talking about rock. In the 50s, in the good old USSR, jazz, pop, and country dominated the charts. The world changed though when country singer Bill Haley covered rhythm and blues singers Big Joe Turner's song, Shake, Rattle, and Roll.
Get crazy, no? Sound off, boy. Let 'em rock a while. Crazy. Eat all of that kitchen, wash your face and hands. Wear your big smiles up because I'm shit you hungry.
Get out in that kitchen and rattle those pots and pans. Get out in that kitchen and rattle those pots and pans. Well, roll my breakfast, cause I'm a hungry man.
The cover became popular and Life magazine called it a frenzied teenage music craze, and thus the birth of rock and roll. You may not know this, but Elvis Presley was sort of the king of rock and roll. He defined how rock and roll was seen. No, not intense headbanging, controversy, and breaking social standards. He was pretty much Marilyn Manson, but with less makeup and more hip thrusting. Probably the same amount of hip thrusting. Eddie Condon denounced Elvis for acting like a sex maniac in public before millions of impressionable kids, while one mother explained why Elvis was bad. Because he's sleazy is why, calling a lady a hound dog and using ain't, it's disgusting! Rock music evoked a sense of rebellion amongst teenagers around the world and became a medium to question what was conventional, even in music. As Chuck Berry said, roll over Beethoven until Tchaikovsky the Muse. This was an age of new music and new ideas, and boy was that true back in the USSR. See what I did there? That was a reference to the Beatles. Oh, talking about the Beatles, it just so happened that USSR citizens loved them. The Kremlin, not so much. You see, the Kremlin thought rock music was dangerous and could lead to a rebellious youth, so they outlawed most Western music. This led to a rebellious youth. Not the best plan. This will now lead us to hipsters, or as they were called in Soviet Russia, the Styliagi. Today's hipsters are obsessed with Eastern medicine, indie artists, and skinny jeans. The Styliagi were obsessed with Western culture, jazz, and rock and roll. The Soviet hipsters, dressed like stereotypical Americans, listened to rock music, and specifically, wait for it, the Beatles. The Styliagi were the first counterculture movement in the USSR, which is a pretty big deal. The problem, as John Brownlee states, was that without CD, flash drives, the internet, or even analog tape recorders to distribute the rare bootleg recordings of the slim supply of Chuck Berry albums that did come into the country, the Styliagi had to get clever. And clever they were. They came up with bone music. Distributors would press music on X-ray discs to make homemade records. Soviet officials caught on, and in 1959, bone music was illegal. By the 1960s, the Komsomol, or the Leninist Young Communist League, sponsored anti-Western music patrols that hunted out distributors of bone music, so the practice had to go to the black market. By the time the Beatles came around, anyone who was listening to them in the USSR was illegal. You'd have to be listening to Revolution by the Beatles on somebody's broken femur. By simply listening to the Beatles in the USSR, you were rebelling against the government. To the historical simulator of awesome! Hey kid, over here. Do you have what I want? Depends on what you're looking for. Do you have the Beatles? The left ankle is Here Comes the Sun. The femur is a revolution. Hurry up, kid, or we might get busted. Fine, I'll take both. Good choice. That's 1 ruble for each disc. It's a good deal. 4 rubles less for a usual 2-sided disc. Fine. And if anyone asks, this never happened. Beatlemania had taken over the USSR. The nationalism and ideologies promoted by Instrumental had been crushed. People abandoned Russian style and began to wear bedlovkas, colorless beetle jackets assembled from cast-offs. Russian cultural commentator Artemy Troitsky says the Beatles turned tens of millions of Soviet youngsters to another religion. Nikita Parturov says the feeling of being part of a vast Beatles community opposing an authoritarian system was everywhere in the former Eastern Bloc countries. The Beatles were a leftist, anti-authoritarian band. They gave birth to the hippie movement, which changed the very idea of politics everywhere. And they knew they had fans in the USSR. Songs like Back in the USSR helped them form a connection with these fans, and then songs like Revolution challenged the views. Lenin said he didn't mind revolution, but once censoring and violence was involved, he drew the line. You say you'll change the Constitution, you tell me it's the institution, but if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't gonna make it with anyone anyhow.
So, after this journey, we come to an interesting realization of how evolving music changed nationalistic feelings and ideologies among different people.
Back in Soviet Russia, this can be seen extremely true in the fall of instrumental music.
Instrumental music was used to promote Soviet ideologies and weed out different opinions.
This boosted general nationalism and shaped the ideologies of people.
However, as musical restrictions were relaxed, the sudden change from classical music to Western rock spawned the first counterculture movement.
These hipsters had a completely new ideological standpoint thanks to music and weren't afraid to question their nation by rebelling.
We also see how music genres like jazz changed ideologies in the USA.
Jazz was able to promote pro-America sentiments and criticize the USSR's beliefs.
This fundamentally changed the way the world saw the Soviet Union.
Meanwhile, rocking hippies in the States demonstrated you could lean to the left and still disapprove of the USSR.
Music was able to shape the minds of many individuals, and when music changes, so do people.
Now you know how hipsters and hippies killed communism.
This has been Discography.
See you next time.